My name is Katie Vaughn, and I am presenting to you Chapter 6 from Change Wars, The Music of Democracy, Emerging Strategies for a New Era of Post-Standardization. This chapter is by Dr. Dennis Shirley. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about who Dr. Shirley is, but then focus mostly on the No Child Left Behind law and then the concept of post-standardization that Dr. Shirley suggests for moving on from the standardization era that we have now. And then I'll bring it up at the end to a close by applying this to my context and to several of yours. So Dr. Shirley is a professor of education at Boston College. He's a prolific speaker, both for presentations and for workshops. As you can tell, he talks with his hands. He has quite a lot of videos up on his website, and so I recommend going to watch some of those if you're interested in some of his ideas. He's also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Educational Change, and he's written a number of recent books. I have a feeling that we may be reading The New Imperatives of Educational Change at some point in the future. This provides a framework about drivers of change that he sees as being important moving into the next decades. He's very interested in mindful practice and in reflective practice. He says on his website that he wants to bring joy and peace back to the classroom. And so if you're interested in that, the second edition of The Mindful Teacher just came out last year, and he also has a website for that. But what is probably going to be most familiar to us is that he co-authored the book, The Fourth Way, with Andy Hargreaves, who wrote the chapter 1 in our Change Wars book on the same model. And then he and Andy Hargreaves also wrote a follow-up to it, looking at the Fourth Way applied to a global context and not just the United States. He and Hargreaves have done a fair amount of writing together on a variety of other things, one of which I'll be referencing later on in this presentation. When I first got into this chapter, I was a little concerned because No Child Left Behind and the concept of standardization in K-12 American public schooling is not something that I've had to worry about before. I have always been in a higher education context as an academic librarian, so this was not something that was part of my professional life, and my children are too young to have been subject to it in elementary schools. So I thought I did some research to just figure out what was going on with No Child Left Behind, and I thought that those of y'all who are also not K-12 educators might appreciate this a little bit. So the bill passed in 2002. This picture here is of George W. Bush signing it with his cadre of people around him. The second man from the left is Ted Kennedy, and the second man from the right is John Boehner. The man in the middle is Secretary of Education Rod Page. I have no idea who the rest of the people are. Sorry. The No Child Left Behind started from a really good place. It had some noble goals. We wanted to show that our students were reaching proficiency levels in math and reading between 3rd and 8th grade. We wanted to demonstrate that schools were making progress year over year in the scores of their students. It was focused on the use of standardized national high stakes testing data that could help both inform the public about what was going on within the educational institutions, provide transparency, this is always a good thing, and also that could inform educational practice by providing information to schools about areas of weakness. And it also required that teachers be highly qualified, which is also, one would think, a good thing to have. However, although the bill was very bipartisan in its drafting, which is why we see both Ted Kennedy and John Boehner attending the signing, something I did not expect to see, it went south really fast. The bill was already being sued in the government was being sued in federal court by states within under a year after it was implemented. And within 2 years, Secretary of Education Rod Page called the NEA, who had been involved in the crafting legislation, he called them a terrorist organization because of how vociferously they were opposing it. And there are 3 things that Shirley mentions as being problematic with No Child Left Behind. One is that it didn't work to help improve national scores on either the National Benchmarking Test, the NAEP, or on the international test that we've read about a bunch this semester, PISA. It also tended to reward teaching to the test. I think this is a phrase many of us have heard. And it also suppressed creativity and imagination in both curricula and also in teaching practice, because schools were punished pretty severely for not making their adequate yearly progress. And so everything got focused on getting students to pass the tests. But most importantly, perhaps to Shirley, he was concerned that using No Child Left Behind data as a shock to a system does not work for trying to build a sustained long-term change in our educational practices. And this harkens back to the chapter we read last week that referred to Good to Great, in which they talk about command and control systems and a shock to the system are great for moving from awful to adequate, but they don't work for adequate to good or good to great. So No Child Left Behind never managed to get renewed. In 2011, President Obama created a waiver program for states to opt out of the program. And by 2013, 39 of the 50 states had filed waivers. The bill was replaced in 2015 by the Every Student Succeeds Act, which rolled back a lot of the standardized testing requirements, the highly qualified requirement on teachers, and the adequate yearly progress requirement. So Shirley suggests that the next era of educational reform should be focused on what he calls post-standardization. And he recognizes that this is a made-up word that includes the idea of standards, but moves beyond it a little bit. He acknowledges that we are going to continue having standardized testing. There are positives to standardized testing, but he suggests that we should weave in 3 other strands into this fugue, if you'd like, of what an educational change and implementation model should look like. So each of these strands is important unto itself, but doesn't really build the full picture until they interweave with each other in a beautiful harmony that creates something better than the sum of its part. This phrase, the music of democracy, comes from a Saul Alinsky quote that refers to dissonance within social conflicts, but that out of that kind of conflict, you get a music of democracy and the greatest harmonies. So the 3 strands of change that I'm going to talk about are this focus on student learning, the spread of signature practices, and then the engagement of the public in political and community organizing to help support educational reform. As I go through these, I hope that you will consider the broad picture of what these are saying and try to apply them to your problem of practice. The first time I read through this, I had a hard time because I was really focused on the K-12 aspect. And as I mentioned, I'm in higher education. And in particular, I'm looking at accessibility and inclusivity in physical spaces and services in the library. So this is pretty far from standardization. But by the time I got to the end of the chapter, I was actually pretty excited about some of the ideas that this particular model could bring to me. And I hope you will be as well. So strand 1 focuses on student learning. And after all, student learning, it feels like we weren't focused on student learning before. This is the point of what we are doing, is for students to learn things. But what Shirley discusses is that really what we were focused on before was on the assessment and on how teachers taught things. And so what we want to do is to turn that around, bring teachers back into the discussion of reform, and really focus down on what is going on with the students. So this image comes from a report that Drs. Hargreaves and Shirley wrote for the Canadian Teachers Federation called The Far Side of Educational Reform, in which they argue that teachers have been left on the far side of reform and have been frozen out of the process. They argue that using the 4th way model, we should bring teachers in to be part of the ideation process of thinking about how we can assess student learning in ways that aren't annual high-stakes national testing on a standardized model. That we should empower our teachers, we should activate them from a politically activated perspective to be those drivers of innovation, because they are the ones who are seeing the students and leading them in the classrooms. We can do that through changing the culture of our teacher assessment. We can promote reflection, we can promote autonomy so that teachers have control over their own practice, and we can also promote professional expertise. This all connects to this concept of responsibility before accountability, which is Catalyst 3 in the fourth way. What you would do here then is, instead of thinking about tracking cohort averages year by year, you would think instead about an individual student's learning over time. And the idea then is that you don't target the students who are most likely to reach proficient and leave behind either the kids who are already above proficient or the ones that are way below, but you treat each student as an individual learner. The problem that Shirley notes is that this requires the public to have trust in a teacher's ability to have autonomy and to make good decisions in their classroom. In The Far Side of Educational Reform, they have this wonderful quote that I think refers to this. This report largely is a retelling of the fourth way, and if you take a look at it, which is useful, it reads very much like Chapter 1 from Change Wars, but then it goes into applications to the Canadian context. But it concludes this way. The way forward is to strengthen the teaching profession even further, to learn from each other as provinces in the way that high-performing countries learn from each other too, and to boldly embrace innovation and inquiry and new approaches to teaching and learning, instead of sticking with delivering incremental improvements in existing practice. I just think that's a really nice quote that goes with this concept of really focusing back on the student and the student's learning. The second strand has to do with signature practices, not with practicing your signature, like dear Lily Rosen and her teenage diary over here on the left, but thinking about what are the local behaviors that we have. This really reminded me of the readings that we've had last semester and this semester on positive deviance and on bright spots. What Shirley talks about here is that you can emphasize the culture and the changes that you want to see and the capacity enhancements that you want to see on the local level, so in the classroom, the school, the district, or even the state, by developing your identity around the things that you already do really well. And you can do that by having teachers or faculty or librarians or whatever going in and observing each other's practices, identifying best practices in their local context, sharing those amongst each others, and building collaborative and reflective practices along the way. He does note that in order to deal with a problem of trust by the public, what if teachers don't pick good practices or good models to emulate? What if they observe the wrong people? One way to counter that is to have strong leadership in your schools and in your districts that can provide tactful feedback to our teachers about what they are doing well and where they can improve. Because we know that some teachers could improve in their teaching practice, but they need to know that and they need to be guided into the right, into stronger practices. So strand 3, when I looked at the rest of Dr. Shirley's publication record, this is clearly the piece that he is really excited about. And whereas the previous 2 strands refer back to, as I mentioned, responsibility before accountability or sustainable leadership and the principles of professionalism from the fourth way, this really gets into pillar number 2, which is public engagement. So Dr. Shirley talks about how we know that socioeconomic status and race are directly related to student achievement on the individual level. And on the district level or the school level or even the state level, social cohesion, income disparities, and access to education are also related to overall student achievement within society. So he argues that what we need to do in order to reform our educational system is to reform our social system. So we need to address the problem of poverty. We need to address the problem of racial, intractable racism within our society. And in order to do that, we should do that by engaging the public in social movements to try to improve these areas. This is something that he has continued to write about extensively in the 8 years since this book came out. And I've referenced one here from 2016 that's called Entrenched Enemies, Tactical Partners, or Steadfast Allies, Exploring the Fault Lines Between Teacher Unions and Community Organizing in the United States. This article is fascinating. And what he does in it is to look at times when teachers' unions and community organizations have fought with each other or collaborated with each other on educational reforms. And what he finds is that when teachers' unions and community organizations come together in agreement on what is broken and how to fix it, they are powerful allies with each other to effect change in the local situation. And so he recommends that that is one way to go about this. Now, remember that this book was written in 2008, 2009, and the world was a different place in those years. After all, Ted Kennedy and John Boehner had just worked on a law together in 2002. One of the concerns that he has is that in general, the population was not engaged in politics at this time. In particular, the African-American community was not hugely involved. Black Lives Matter as a movement had not started, and the poor and working class were not involved in politics either. I would argue that some of that has possibly changed in the last couple of years between the social anger over police shootings of Black men and Native American men, and also the election of 2016. We may be in a slightly different political climate, but nonetheless, the issue of a general disengagement from politics is one that would be a problem here. So as I mentioned, I was a little bit disturbed at the beginning of this chapter because I was afraid that this would not be relevant to me. But as I read it, I realized that there's a lot going on in here that does relate to general education contexts, even to library space planning. So I'm interested, as I mentioned, in accessibility and inclusivity in our public spaces. The picture here is of our current Accessible Technologies Lab, and I hate this picture, but I hate the room even more. It just makes me shiver. I just can't take it. When I think about this, the law that's relevant to me is not the education bill. It's the Americans with Disabilities Act. There are similar problems with the ADA, including that it is by its nature behind technology and behind social progress. And it provides some standards, but they don't go very far, and it's easy to get out of them in this case. So if I look at the three strands here, when I think about a focus on learning, then that suggests to me that I should be using frameworks that speak directly to the users, our students, staff, faculty, and community members who are at the center of this question and of the problem. And so the ethical reasoning framework that we have developed at JMU, and then ability and queer studies theories will be useful to me as a framework to keep those populations at the center of my consideration. Signature practices in this one is fun for me. I'm trying to develop an identity as going beyond the minimum standards of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and even pushing the boundaries of universal design to really build a truly inclusive community space. To do this, I can find the bright spots that are already in existence at JMU or at other libraries or museums or other public institutions around the country, which means I might get to go on a field trip. And then finally, this is a social justice issue, and it's one in which we do have some communities that are politically active. I am partnering with our Office of Disability Services, but even more interesting, Madison Equality, which is our LGBTQ plus student group, is a hugely politically active group. And right now they are lobbying our president to make a ruling that says that every time a building is renovated or built, for every pair of gendered bathrooms, there should be one non-gendered bathroom created. Now that would make a huge difference within libraries renovation, which is coming up in a few years. And so this is a political movement that I can work with and capture for moving forward in my own problem of practice. So this is, in a nutshell, what these three strands along with the standards are. And as I was reading this article, I kept thinking about different problems of practice and interventions that y'all have as well. So I have some examples of those tied into these. When I look at the focus on learning, the first one I think about is Jessie. Jessie, you've created an intervention that literally changes the focus from the lecturing teacher to kindergartners learning math using manipulatives in their hands. And I think that that so physically demonstrates this concept of refocusing on student learning. Justin's community of inquiry is something that I think fits within the signature practices concept. And in fact, Shirley mentions communities of inquiry as one way to build that culture and the identity through the signature practices concept. Lisa is also looking at signature practices because in addition to the modules that you're creating for your Writing Center tutors to learn how to better support those second language learners, you also have a scaffolded observation program that you have for them to learn from their peers. And that's a perfect example of looking for the bright spots and building a culture of collaborative practice. The community organizing piece and then the signature practices together are building in culture, and they're bringing in identity, and they're engaging our public as well. And I think that two of us are doing that very well. So first there's Tanya, who's looking at this way to shift the culture in Yuma County so that it supports college degree attainment. This is a social justice issue just as much as providing accessible spaces is, because we know that education is one of the drivers of economic development for our communities. And then Richard's work with improving the academic performance of Latino boys also falls under this concept of community organizing, I think, because he is looking at ways to engage these boys with their identity and their culture, and also on teaching their teachers how to do that as well. So I think that's pretty exciting. In the end, I really loved this chapter, and I hope that you got something out of it as well. I look forward to the discussion. This is my reference list and further reading. I particularly suggest this report from the Canadian Teachers Federation for a nice overview of the fourth way, and then also the applications. And then the article from Leadership and Policy in Schools is fascinating as a historical look at the relationship between teachers unions and community-based organizations. Thank you so much.